Good morning and welcome to another We Are Sunderland morning briefing. My name's Joe Ramage. I'm joined by Dom Shaw today. We're coming here on the 29th of May. Before we get going, quick shout out to our sponsors as always, to the Fans Museum in Sunderland and the Prospects Opticians. Once again, Dom, there's plenty to talk about. We've got a little bit of under-21s to talk about, which we'll start with, but there's also transfer news with Jack Clarke and obviously the head coach situation. Bit of a spoiler, given the fact that we're going to discuss the head coach situation last. I think that tells you that there's not a lot of movement at the moment. So we'll get there. But yeah, there's only one place to start really, isn't there? And that's with Sunderland's under-21s at the weekend. Premier League 2 playoff final down at Tottenham. Result didn't go their way. We predicted that it would be a difficult game for them against a really strong Tottenham team who'd already beat them a couple of times this season as well. Proved to be the case, but Sunderland really gave a very good account of themselves in that game. On another day, they could have won the game. They could have been the ones lifting the trophy at the end of the day. But what an experience for them. What a season. I guess just your initial thoughts on the 21s if we start there.
Exactly what we said before, and I think what we'd said last week, regardless of how it played out on Sunday. And clearly it'd have been great if they'd have finished on a high with the victory and the trophy. But to get to the final and the manner that they got to the final as well, I think the young lads involved will take so much from it. And Graeme Murty spoke beforehand, didn't he, about regardless of how the final plays out, there'll be immense pride. You were there. You obviously spoke to him. Was that the feeling coming out, that the overriding feeling was pride in what they've done?
Yeah, I think so. There was a little bit of disappointment, a little bit of frustration, as there is, at any level losing a game of football. And I think because of the way that they played as well, I asked him, are there any regrets? Because they had played so well. They hit the post twice, Harrison Jones, Tommy Watson. There are a couple of good chances where, like I said at the start of the vid there, on another day, they could have won that game, or they certainly could have forced extra time that we'd seen again in the semi-final and the quarterfinals. So there was a little bit of disappointment there with that. And Murty said, yeah, there are regrets that we didn't take our chances. Regrets in that we gave Will Lancashire too much time in the box for both of his goals. Again, someone that we identified before the game, wasn't it? But once he skirted around that, there was just an immense pride. We were stood there pitch side in that stadium, and what a stadium that new Spurs ground is. When you're down there and you're really looking around, and it's all encompassing. It's just a fantastic venue. What an experience it will have been for them to play. And then you can kind of take a step back and take stock of that and just think, this has been a really good achievement from what the team have done, because there was no expectations of them to go and do what they did this season. I think Murty even addressed that himself. If he was being honest, him and the staff didn't expect them to get that far. If you go back to August, I think they finished last season, I think they won 2 of their last 11 league games. Flip that this season, they won 6 of the first 11. So it just shows how much of a shift that there's been over the summer. Now, I know the first half of the season incorporated some first-team players, fringe players, injured players, etc., etc. But it's actually been down the stretch of this season that's been perhaps more impressive, where it's just been purely on those lads in the academy and what they've done and the resilience and the mentality that they've shown to go back to the well, as Graeme Murty said, time and time again, particularly in the playoff campaign, has been hugely impressive. And you've got to think that it would stand them in good stead. Now, look, I know that they were stood there, and like I say, any team that stands and watches the opposition lifting a trophy, it's going to be frustrating. But I particularly liked what he said, in terms of they've got to use this as fuel. Him as a player, he said the best fuel that I ever had was, looking at where we can go next and using defeat as fuel so you don't suffer that feeling again. And that appeared to be the overriding emotion. We spoke to Harrison Jones as well. And again, you could see he was a bit downbeat, a bit dejected, but you could clearly take positives from the season. Him as a player, them as a team. Ellis Taylor came out and spoke as well about his final game. And like I said, the overall mood felt very content. Frustration at the result, naturally, but one where you can take stock. And even now, a couple of days on, I would imagine they'll all be sitting there thinking, we've had a really good season. The problem's going to be for them, how on earth do they go and better that next season, given how much they probably jumped ahead of themselves this year?
And we touched on it last week, didn't we? About kind of what the immediate future looks like for some of these lads. We know, for example, that Taylor's going, but for the others, was there any indication afterwards from Murty as to how things might play out? Whether these lads will be involved again next year, whether any of them will be knocking on the first team door, whether loan moves might be on the cards for some of them?
Yeah, it's a good question. They were very reserved about it, really, saying it's up to the first team staff. To be perfectly honest, I think the question was put to them about pre-season being a key factor. We've mentioned that before. Which of these group will be going to Spain with the first team? Which of them will be going to Italy with the academy setup? And at the moment, I think that's just going to be a case of a decision to be made by the club, a new head coach, whoever that will be when they're appointed, making that decision closer to the time when the two squads both return. We mentioned some names, didn't we, last week? And you've got to mention Tommy Watson. I thought he was excellent in the second half. He tore the right back to shreds, to be perfectly honest. I think it was. Time and time again, he just drove at him and he had the beating of him. I say he hit the post early on. He was a constant threat, and he was one that was on the minds of quite a few staff at Tottenham. You know, Graeme Murty came around and he said, I wish the Tottenham staff would stop patting us on the back saying how good we are, because it's frustrating having lost. And that was something that sort of transcended into our area in the press box as well. There was people, Tottenham staff, saying they were impressed with how Sunderland played, and he was one particularly that stood out. You can see him going from strength to strength at the moment, and we said err on the side of caution with him, particularly next season. But if he is one that does go with the first team squad, it's going to be a huge chance for him to really thrive in that environment, because he, particularly in this playoff campaign as well, he's really kicked on and he's shown a lot of signs. Harrison Jones also mentioned Watson as well, saying he's had that taste of first team football, and I don't want to say jealous, but you could sense that there was a feeling there saying, yeah, we want that as well, and that's the case. And I thought Jones fought really, really well in terms of how he's lent on some of the first team players before. I think there was a piece came out in We Are Sunderland and yourselves with the Echo where he mentioned how he lent on like Corey Evans, Alex Pritchard, Dan Neil, and he spoke about that quite at length, how it can sometimes be intimidating as a young player having to go and reach out to these players, but because of the integration at the Academy of Light, how the club have done it over the last couple of years, it's an easy boundary to break. And he said once you break it, he's found that the senior players are only too happy to come and help them with their game, and he's obviously played in a deeper role and a more advanced role as well. So I thought it was quite interesting to hear things like that, and that's something that's only going to develop more this season, obviously with the experience that they've got as well.
Just on Watson, I know we touched on him last week, and we said that managing expectations is going to be key there, especially if Jack Clarke moves on, which we're going to get onto. But how do you see at this moment now, next season playing out for him? Do you expect him to be a regular in the first team? Do you expect him to get? And I know there's the uncertainty at the minute with the head coach, which again we're going to get to. A loan for Watson, or is it still too early for him, given his age and the fact he hasn't played much first team football yet, or a year down the line, will he have had another year mainly playing for the 21s? How do you expect the next season to play out for him?
Yeah, I think he's the unique one, because there could be a strong case, and I might contradict myself in what I've said previous weeks about him, but he's the one that feels as though he could make an impact, go straight in and be there just because of that raw ability, that raw just desire to go and drive at a defender. We mentioned the Jack Clarke reference last week in the preview to the game. And again, it was just so on show that he just picks the ball and carry the ball at ease and at will and beat defenders. And it's such a good attribute to have, that even at that age and that inexperience, you do wonder whether that can be an asset to Sunderland at first team level. Again, we spoke about the age group of the first team, like Joe Bellingham, Chris Rigg. They're in there 16 and 18. Is there any reason why Watson can't go in at 17, turning 18 later in the year? You'd argue probably not. It's going to be really interesting. I think he probably will be one that will go with the first team squad just out to Spain. If he has a good pre-season, the decision then is going to have to be made. You probably look at the first month of the campaign, drop him into a few squads on the bench. Can he come off the bench? What happens there? And then you've got a big judgment call to make. Do you keep him in the 21s until January, see how he does the first half of the season? Do you keep him around the first, and then to be around the first team squad as well? Or can you loan him off, do a short-term loan, National League or League Two, something like that, just to get his teeth really stuck into senior football, see how he copes? Because it's a real risk and reward, isn't it? You don't want to break him with that. You don't want to, if it was to be an unsuccessful loan, you wonder how that will impact his mentality. On the flip side, how then would he deal with it if it was, if he shows the right response in coming back? So he's the one that there's probably going to be a big decision to make, just purely because of the raw ability that he's got, and he's becoming noticed as well. Like I say, that was touchline and press box where people really stand up and take notice of him, and he's someone that's been on the lips of supporters and questions that Graeme Murty's had to ask quite routinely as well, and probably rightly so, because he just has that bit of flair about him that supporters really love to see.
And so often with managers, you talk about whether they're willing to give academy players a chance, whether they're willing to dip down to the 21s and give those youngsters a chance. The new head coach, whoever it is going to be one of those who does that, because it has to be. It will surely have had to play a major part in talks that have gone on with the various head coach candidates over recent months. And not just because of the 21s, but because of the age of the team, full stop, because of the age of the first team. Whoever comes in is clearly going to have to be comfortable working with and coaching young players. So because of that, the transition from the 21s to the first team might not be quite as big a step as what it is at other clubs. Now, I'm not disputing the fact that, playing for the 21s regularly and stepping up to become a regular for the first team in the Championship, for Sunderland's first team, with all the expectations that comes with that, it's clearly a huge step. But because they're so closely, because they work so closely together, because we know that the 21s train so regularly with the first team, you would hope that these young lads are well equipped to make that step if and when the chance comes. And whoever the new head coach is, the young lads are clearly already going to be kind of 1-0 up and impressing them, because the new boss is coming knowing that this current crop of young players have done so well this season.
Absolutely. And that's also why you can make a case for it being a bit of frustration that there isn't a new head coach in at the end of the season.
It was there on Sunday,
Sunday and this playoff campaign, because I mean, like I say, Tottenham are the best team at this level. They rightly deserve to win it overall. I think they've lost 2 games in the league. They've got a striker there who could very well be in the Championship next season for what he's done. I think it was reported £2 million from Sheffield United from a couple of years ago. That is what they were up against, and I thought Graeme Murty again was excellent when he said, I welcome playing against players like that. Now, look, there was frustration of the goals conceded, but he was happy, and he's constantly sort of addressed that message, saying that he wants his team to be exposed almost to mistakes and quality like that, so that they can learn from it, and that was the best case for them, and like I say, the environment of that. But yeah, the first team gap, particularly at Sunderland, is one that feels as though it can be bridged, I don't want to say easily, but it is one that they're very much open to. Mike Dodd said it in terms of the coach has to be a developmental coach. And just to touch on Ned's comment here, if you're good enough, you're old enough, and that is it's the perfect message, really, if we're going back to Watson as well, because that does ring true. And you look at what they've done this season, in contrast with what the first team have done towards the second half of the season, you'd almost be daft not to be looking at some of these lads, because they're going to bounce back into the Academy of Light in a couple of weeks' time when they've had the break, thinking, right, what's next? Can they make the step up? Because almost at the moment, they might, with a bit about them, they might think that some of those first team shirts are available, particularly someone like Watson, if Clarke is going to go, or the wing areas. We've spoken about them on the pods before, even the right wing. There's positions in that first team that you think can possibly be up for grabs. Even centre midfield, you look at someone like Harrison Jones. Now, again, something that impressed me about him is you asked him, how can you better this season, or what do you need to do? He mentioned his physical attributes. He needs to become a bit more explosive, I think the term was. For someone that young to be identifying these things, again, by leaning on the expert, that can only be good. It's positives that is being drummed into them. And it goes back to Graeme Murty's job as well, to be honest. That what him and John Hewitson have done there this season in particular has been absolutely excellent. And that was something that I wanted to actually bring up with you in terms of Murty. There's a bit of conversation on his future that's to come over the coming days, but where do you see him? Because he's been involved with the first team at times. We saw him towards the end of last season under Mike Dodds in particular. Is there almost a case to say that he could have played an even bigger role during the interim period with Dodds, given what he's done?
Well, it's interesting, because I was going to come to you and say that we've rightly praised the players at length in the last couple of weeks, but Murty deserves immense credit as well for the job he's done, doesn't he? And he's done it. This impressive half of the season is obviously when the 21s have kind of really come into form and made the final. He did a lot of that while juggling both roles, while working for the first team as well. And I was going to say, I know it's maybe slightly unorthodox, but is that a possibility? Is that a full-time possibility? Will it help? Will it help the transition between the 21s and the first team? It's a difficult one, isn't it? Because Murty's clearly got an awful lot to offer. He's clearly very highly rated, and he's clearly very good at what he does. So with all that in mind, you think, well, you want him in the first team setup, and yet developing the 21s, developing the youngsters who are coming through, not just the 21s, because it's other age groups who are playing in that age group, isn't it? Is clearly such a major part of Sunderland's longer term thinking. That is such an important job that to have someone in there who's doing that so well is also pivotal as well. So is it possible longer term to combine the two? I don't know. It comes back to, as so many things does, as the Jack Clarke thing that we're going to talk about, as transfers that we're inevitably talk about. It comes back to the identity of the man in the dugout, doesn't it? What's Mike Dodds' future? What's the rest of the coaching team? Is the new man in charge going to bring anyone in? If he does and Dodds stays, is there a role then in the first team coaching setup, or do you risk kind of overinflating that and having too many there? For all those uncertainties, I think kind of one thing is without doubt is Murty has to play a central role going forward, has to be there playing a central role moving forward, because he's done so well this year in difficult circumstances as well, because he juggled those roles while things were not going to plan for the first team, and while against kind of the backdrop of uncertainty and turbulence. I think, as I said at the start of this, really, he deserves immense credit for the job he's done, and I'm pretty sure all the young lads in that team will say the same.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one thing that they often do say when you speak to them, just the feel-good factor that he instills around there. And I picked up on we were speaking to Harrison Jones, and Murty walked past and he sort of nudged him and said, stop hitting the post, Jones. He just like a bit of tongue-in-cheek. You always wonder whether that was too soon, but it was taken completely in the right context. And you think that just his way of the way that these sort of, trying to think of the right word for it, but just took the sort of pressure out of the situation and that feeling of frustration and disappointment, trying to diffuse that. They obviously had the moment. They had a moment on the pitch as well. He gathered all the players and staff in a big huddle, and you could see him. He was front and centre of it. Everyone's on board with him, and I think that's something that's transcended into the first team as well. Luke O'Nien mentioned it after the Sheffield Wednesday game, the final game of the season. He name dropped Murty quite a bit in terms of helping the first team players with the technique on things as well. So clearly, the bridge between the two, he's an important figure in that, and he seems to have been a really good appointment for the club over the last 18 months. So he is one, again, with head coach stuff that you have to think he's going to have to be involved. He must be one of the ones that the club are adamant that they want to keep in. We've heard about Dodds and Proctor, want to keep them in the staff and in the structure. Murty absolutely is up there as well. And I guess to wrap up the 21s, you just have to say full credit to the job that he's done there with John Hewitton and the players this season.
Yeah, one last one on it. What I think Murty does well, and I think this is often a kind of difficult balance to strike, really, when you speak to development coaches, under 21s, 18s, is that balance between wanting results and ultimately realising that their job is to prepare players for the first team, ideally for the Sunderland first team, but to produce first team footballers, be it at Sunderland or elsewhere, further down the ladder, maybe up the ladder in time to come if Sunderland can make money on these players. And I think Murty's struck that balance well. The balance between, I know what the kind of ultimate aim is when you're a development coach, but we also want to do that. We also want to produce players while getting results, and that matters. Winning matters, and I think he's struck that balance well. Let's talk Jack Clarke.
Yeah,
probably for the first time of many this summer. Well, I say the first. I know we've touched on him, but bit of concrete stuff this week.
Yeah, inevitable, really, isn't it? It was a matter of when, not if, the interest was going to come in. And obviously, the story broke yesterday that Southampton were going to firm up their interest in number of teams, to be honest, who've been quite long-term admirers of him. Their promotion to the Premier League in the playoff final, obviously, it's only going to aid their pursuit of him, isn't it, really? It's going to be the first of, like you say, probably one of a number of clubs who are going to test Sunderland's resolve over the coming weeks.
Yeah, and Southampton have watched and liked Clarke for a fair old while, as you said there. That one of a number of clubs they have kind of monitored him throughout the season. It probably all hinged on whether they won promotion or not, didn't it? If they were going to be gearing up for a second season in the Championship, then suddenly signing one of the Championship's best players becomes unlikely. Now they've won promotion; it's a completely different kettle of fish. Interest is we know interest is inevitable this summer. What's going to be interesting is how much interest, how that affects the price, and what Clarke's thinking is in all this. And again, I think what that comes back to is the head coach, who's if he is to be tempted to stay at Sunderland, convinced to stay at Sunderland. Because what we should say is when you go back to last summer and January, the way Clarke handled everything that was surrounding him was excellent, wasn't it? It didn't let it affect him at all. I know the second half of the season wasn't as explosive and impressive as the first half was, but that was down to the injury, obviously, more than anything else. So we know that he's not the type. We know that he's not the type of player who'll let the uncertainty and the speculation affect him. But and we know it doesn't often play out like this. Someone want this resolved one way or another, sooner rather than later. The new head coach will surely want this resolved one way or another, sooner rather than later. We were chatting earlier, weren't we? Just before we recorded this about general things. We were saying Sunderland have held talks with a number of candidates over the course of the weeks and months. In those talks, the potential head coach candidate will have come in with questions, and two of the leading questions will surely have been: am I going to get a centre forward this summer? What type of centre forward am I going to get this summer? Am I going to have Jack Clarke in my team next season? If the answer to either is no, then your follow-up question is, well, what's the kind of backup plan? And with Clarke, obviously you want to know, well, if he's going to go, how much are Sunderland wanting? How much of that am I then going to get to reinvest into the team? Now, you would think that whoever's coming in is going to have assurances one way or another on that. They're clearly going to know more than we do. But it is something that Sunderland don't want, and inevitably these things play out like this. You don't want this running till the final weeks, days, hours, minutes of the window, do you? Like the Ross Stewart window. And the Ross Stewart thing felt like last summer, like it had an inevitable outcome. Does feel like the Clarke thing's similar this year, doesn't it? This window.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of you don't want it to go. If there's an overriding sense that he's going to leave, you'd rather it happen before the start of the season than maybe get 2 or 3 games out of him from then leave on transfer deadline day or at the end of August, and then you're sort of scurrying around trying to find a replacement. Then these are all things that have to be put in place now.
A replacement needs to be in place before, doesn't it?
Yeah, and on that, like, what do you think the backup plan is? I mean, you're taking someone like Clarke out of that team. Spoke about it at length. 19 goal contributions, 15 goals, 4 assists. It's funny, I've been going back through the Michael Jordan documentary, The Last Dance. It's almost like taking Jordan out of the 93-94 Bulls team, isn't it? Taking Jack Clarke out of this Sunderland team based on the last 2 seasons. Especially given there's nobody putting in as much input as him in terms of goals and assists last season. What is the backup plan? How much of the reinvestment? What sort of a figure do you think that Sunderland can command for Clarke this summer? 2 years left on his deal. Southampton are the ones that are at the moment the leading interest. But do you see that as his level, just as a newly promoted team, or do you think that someone else from the bottom half of the Premier League might come in? We've heard interest from Brentford, Everton, the likes of that. Wolves, I think, have been interested as well over the time. West Ham. How do you see it all playing out?
I think Clarke can cut it in the Premier League. I would see him having no problems. There's been a lot of talk about Jared Bowen leaving West Ham this year. If Bowen was to leave, for example, you could see them lining Clarke up as a potential replacement. Now, I know you'd say that's a huge step to replace an England international, but Bowen was a Championship player when he signed. And for all it was a shorter space of time at Hull, he wasn't quite as impressive over a prolonged period as Clarke's been at Sunderland. There's a lot that Sunderland can offer to bump up the price, isn't there? Young English forward, in demand, 2 years left on his contract, has played in the Premier League before, so I know it didn't go to plan, but he was 18 then. So there's an awful lot to offer there. I mean, as a price, you've got absolute minimum looking at north of 15 million, aren't you? I think. What's interesting, as you say there, is what then happens. Tony Mowbray talked about this a few times, didn't he? What he'd like, he said, when he was in charge is if and when a player goes for big money like that, for a large bulk of that to be then put back in it to say, right, well, go and buy a couple of replacements. How likely is that to be the case? This is still kind of the one unknown with this kind of model, isn't it? What happens when a player goes for big money? Now, it might become a common occurrence down the line. Patterson, Neil, Clarke, Bellingham, Hume. There's several, isn't there? But as things stand, we don't really know what happens when it goes. I know there was obviously the Ross Stewart example. He's slightly different. He was further down the line with his career. It was obviously very, very late in the window. So it'll be interesting to see how Sunderland approach that.
And on Ross Stewart as well, Southampton's promotion triggered a bit of a cash windfall for Sunderland as well, which can only help in the summer. But on the Clarke stuff, given no head coach there, do you think that those are conversations? I know that the head coach who's coming in isn't going to have final say on transfers, ins and outs and all this, but they've got to be involved in something along the lines of that. Can these conversations happen in full while there isn't a head coach in place, or is something such as crucial as Clarke's future as well?
They've got to surely have a say on that, because I think whatever conversations have been had in Sunderland board meetings between Sunderland bosses will have to have been had with potential candidates as well, especially if talks with a head coach candidate or candidates are well down the line, as you'd hope there would be at this stage of the summer. You know, I don't think we're going to be at a stage in interviews now where it's kind of a getting to know you. We're surely going to be more in kind of intricacies of how we'll, you know, the minor details of how things are going to play out next year. Does Sunderland know how the Jack Clarke situation is going to play out? Do they have an idea as to how it's going to play out and how they deal with that? I think one of the uncertainties is you talk about replacing Clarke. Well, because we don't know who the next head coach is, we don't really have an idea how the team might line up. Will he rely on orthodox wingers? Will he be? Does he kind of like an out and out wide man, or does he line up his forward line differently with terms of kind of fluid forward? So that's why it's difficult to talk about how you directly replace him, isn't it? And I know we obviously go back to Ramage Mundle, who came in January, and ideally when you're losing a player, you've already got a replacement in the building. It's unfair to judge Mundle on his first 6 months in English football, back in English football with Spurs, with Sunderland. Obviously, he'd come through the ranks of Spurs. But judging on what we've seen so far, he's going to have to step up, isn't he, if he's going to replace Jack Clarke? Same with Tommy Watson. We've talked about him, clearly a huge talent, but expecting him to step in and replace one of the Championship's best forwards, best wide attackers is a huge ask. These are all questions that need to be answered, don't they, in the coming weeks? Yeah,
that's what I mean. You think, I mentioned earlier, shirts up for grabs. If you're looking at players who could possibly step in for a Clarke, like you said there, it's a big ask, isn't it? So how much pressure does that put on the decision in terms of there's 2 years left on his deal? So realistically, from this point on, the value, regardless of how well he performs if he stays, is only going to depreciate. How big of a factor is that in their thinking? Do you think in terms of cash in? This is probably January gone and this summer are probably the highest value that you're going to get for him, unless he's going to sign a new deal, which we feel as though is going to be unlikely at this stage. He could stay for 6 months, 12 months, have another cracking season with Sunderland, whatever happens, promoted or not. That value is only going to decrease, isn't it? So it's a real sort of it's a difficult moment for them, isn't it? And a difficult decision to make.
And I think that's why this summer it's always felt more like a probability than a possibility, hasn't it? And I think the other thing as well is when you're talking about signing a potential replacement, I get what Mowbray was saying about it'd be nice to go out and splash a bit more on a replacement for a departing star. But the problem is, if the player's already gone, then selling clubs suddenly know you've got however much money burning a hole in your pocket. Now, I know football doesn't work like that. If Sunderland get 15 million for Clarke, they're not then going to go out and spend 15 million on a winger. But that's why, again, in an ideal world, you want your replacement in the building first, don't you? And you do want it for everyone involved. You want it resolved before the season starts. But I don't know. I think I'd be more surprised if that was the case. I'd be more surprised if this didn't go to the final stages of the window than if it did.
Yeah, you wonder what sort of Jack Clarke's thinking right now, don't you? How sort of privy he is to the head coach discussions, which we're going to come on to now. We made it half an hour without bringing it up. Curtis has dropped a message. Who are we getting as head coach? Dom, who are Sunderland going to get as head coach? Today marks 100 days since Michael Beale left the club back in February. Mike Dodds obviously took the final 13 games, gave the club a bit of luxury that clubs don't often have in terms of finding a replacement. Coming from Elliot came in earlier as well. Day 100 with no manager. Any idea what the record is? Well, actually, I've done a little piece on We Are Sunderland this afternoon, this morning rather. They did go 141 days back in 2006 after Mick McCarthy was sacked. Kevin Ball caretaker at the end of the season, and then Niall Quinn appointed in the July, self-appointed before Roy Keane. But yeah, 100 days in, I mean, just where do you think it all sets now? We're heading very close to that threshold of June, which we alluded to last week, where things might or might not escalate in terms of contracts or garden leave or things like that, where we've seen other head coaches saying they'll take over their duties from the beginning of the month. Equally, we've seen clubs in the Championship. Plymouth have gone out, fired and hired since the end of the season with Wayne Rooney going in. Norwich look as though they're on the brink. Will Still was linked there. He's one who's still in the frame at Sunderland as we understand it. But yeah, where do things stand as we hit the milestone?
They stand pretty much exactly as they were last time we spoke on last Friday, I think it was. The indication is now, obviously, with these things, it can change. It can change in an instant. The indication is that as things stand, that there's no expectation that anyone's going to be in place this week in the coming days. Now that might change. Hopefully it does. For our sake, it'd be great to have that to write about. So it'd be nice if it did. But that's the indication as things stand. The only real thing that has changed since we last spoke on Friday is the Norwich developments. Johannes Hoftharup looks set to go in as head coach there. Now Will Still was interviewed there, which we talked about last Friday. It never got further than he was one of a number of candidates being lined up at that stage, or being spoken to at that stage. Thorup was one of the very early names that came out, so it seemed, didn't it, that he was top of their wish list. So he's going in there. That leaves Will Still free. Now we know there are head coach candidates who Sunderland have spoken to, who we don't know who they are, whose names haven't got out. But of the names that have crept out or emerged, Still is the one really where there's still Paul Heckingbottom as well. But as you discuss in your piece today on We Are Sunderland, which is great, well worth a read. If it was going to be Heckingbottom, if Heckingbottom was first choice, if they really wanted Heckingbottom, then you'd think that had been done by now. So it all points still towards Still. Now I know there's still a kind of putting two and two together job, but when you do put two and two together with the Sunderland head coach situation at the minute, it's hard not to come to the conclusion of Will Still. But as we've said,
if it is Still, just to jump in, if he is the number one candidate, which open for debate, but there's clearly a very there's a common theme there that like you said, that it does point towards it could be him. At what point do you sort of give him an ultimatum almost to make this decision? Because Sunderland have clearly been interested in him before when Mowbray got sacked. And then whatever the developments have been this season before his exit from Reims, a month down the line now, getting into June, the European Championships start soon. How often do things happen during European Championships or summer tournaments, things like that? Players then will return in about a month's time. At what point do you, as the club, give someone like Still, if that is the direction you go on, give him an ultimatum saying we need a decision here before we go to a backup candidate or a second or third choice, whatever you want to call it?
Well, this is the thing. It's interesting, isn't it? Because if you're a head coach at the minute, there's a lot of moving parts in the Championship as things stand. We know Hull want a manager. We know Norwich want a manager. Plymouth wanted a manager. Leicester are soon going to be looking for a manager. And the suggestions are that could then mean that West Brom are going to be looking for a manager, because indications are that Leicester are going to have a look at Corberan. So if you're a head coach,
Burnley, another one as well.
Yeah, Burnley, sorry, with company. Yeah. So you'd understand if head coaches want to kind of assess the options and see kind of how things are going to progress in the coming days and weeks. But if you're a club, Sunderland obviously being one of those, how long do you wait? You need an answer, don't you? You need a head coach in place, and if you can't get an answer from one candidate, then there comes a time that you're going to have to move. Like you said, there does come a time when there has to be an ultimatum, and you have to move on. We don't know if that's the case at Sunderland. We don't know. Do they have a candidate? Do they have their candidate lined up, and a kind of small issues just being resolved? Are they still choosing between two or three? Are they waiting on someone, or are Sunderland, or are the candidates still waiting on Sunderland? These are all the unknowns. And it goes back to what we've said for a few weeks now. The longer these unknowns remain, the closer we trickle towards the players returning and the transfer window opening and pre-season starting and the season starting. So 100 days does feel like there's a sense of urgency now, doesn't it?
It does feel as though you're getting that way. But equally, I think what I stress in that piece as well that's gone out this morning, it's the next 100 days as well, which are almost more important now. And I know that's easy to say, because could have had a head coach in at any point over the last 100 days. But within the next 100 days, your players are back. You've done pre-season. You've done the first month of the Championship season, and the transfer window is closed. Now, that first month in the transfer window, regardless of who comes in, they're going to be the key sort of aspects as to how successful or not successful Sunderland may be over the course of the next season, aren't they? Because they are overriding, certainly the transfer window, clear factors that the club need to get right. And as we've sort of discussed, the head coach doesn't necessarily have the final say in recruitment anyway. So the next phase of this, obviously getting the head coach out, I'm not undermining how important that is, but this next period, if we're talking milestones, this next 100 days, for example, this is the crucial moment, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And although the head coach doesn't have the final say, they have to have a say, don't they? What you want is everyone pulling in the same direction. And that's where transfers and targets and the type of players they're going for, the identity of the players they're going for, will undoubtedly have featured in conversations. But if you're one of those players who Sunderland are trying to sign, if you're Jack Clarke and you're assessing your options this summer, it would surely kind of give you a bit more clarity in your mind if you knew exactly how Sunderland were going to look next season, who your manager was going to be, what he's like, have your first conversations with him. And that's why I think in the coming weeks it feels like we need a conclusion to this. Someone needs to come in. And yeah, undoubtedly, as you say, the next 100 days is going to determine whether the last 100 days was understandable, whether Sunderland did the right thing by waiting it out, by not jumping on someone as soon as they sacked Beale, and by not appointing someone as soon as the season finishes. It's the next 100 days that's going to determine how things look, isn't it? And how the decisions of the last 6 or 7 months play out in the long term.
Yeah, and just to finish up here, I just want to touch on Michael's comment. They must have asked people. The truth is, being turned down, but don't mention it. I have mentioned it, but the possibility of being turned down by any potential candidate is also a realistic prospect, isn't it? Because we've mentioned the clubs who are looking for a manager and who potentially might be looking for a manager. The byproduct of playing this waiting game is that really comes into consideration now, doesn't it, for the managers who, to be honest, it's probably them who are dictating things now. It's not the clubs who are dictating, it's the managers who have a field to play, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you are, I know, like, we don't want to hear it from a Sunderland perspective, but if you are a head coach, then an in-demand head coach, you'd obviously do that. But then if you're a head coach, you run the risk of, if you don't take an opportunity like Sunderland, which is a huge opportunity, huge club, brilliant playing squad, so much going for it, despite the disappointment of the most recent season, you might never get that. You might never get that opportunity again. Whether they have been turned down, we don't know. The chances are they will have spoken to people. I was only reading last night that Steve Cooper's turned down the possibility of joining Burnley because he's waiting for Premier League jobs. I'm sure they'll have sounded people out who at this stage aren't interested in that job because they've got eyes on other jobs. Have they sounded out Liam Rossini after he was made available after his Hull exit? These are the things we don't know. But it'll be you would hope, wouldn't you, that I think when the head coach appointment is made, it'll give us a clearer indicator of why things have played out like they have. If it's still, for example, then, well, we know why he wasn't appointed straight away because he was still in a job. Was there then after obviously after he leaves Reims, there's need for talks. Is there things to be resolved there? If it was, I don't think it will be, but I might be wrong. If it was someone like Heckingbottom, then your question is, well, why isn't that being made? Why isn't that appointment being made straight away? Kind of where is he on the list if Heckingbottom, who's been available all this time, is appointed? So I think when the appointment is finally made, it'll make things clearer as to why the process has played out as it has done, if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense, and we'll leave it there. Fingers crossed that an appointment isn't too far away, although we have been saying that for a couple of weeks now, but time is ticking on. John, thanks very much for joining us this morning.
Yeah, cheers, John.
We will be back later in the week, all being well, with another update and another Wheelhouse and briefing. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for interacting as always.